On a Saturday morning in the spring of 1987, at a farm equipment auction outside of Waverly, Iowa, a man named Gus Henderman paid $50 for a tractor that the auctioneer had trouble keeping a straight face while describing. The machine was a 1939 Allis-Chalmers Model B. It had come to the auction from the estate of an elderly farmer named Harold Pitts, who had passed away the previous winter at the age of 91, having farmed the same 120 acres in Bremer County since 1934 without acquiring much in the way of modern equipment or modern debt. The Model B had been Harold's primary garden tractor for the last 20 years of his life, used for the 2-acre vegetable operation he maintained behind the house and for the light field work that his aging body could still manage without assistance. Before that, it had been his son's tractor, and before that, Harold himself had used it for work that a machine of its size, small, narrow, light, with a 4-cylinder engine producing somewhere around 16 horsepower, was genuinely suited for. By 1987, it was 48 years old. The red paint, Allis-Chalmers' distinctive Persian orange, that had faded through the decades to something closer to the color of old brick, was peeling in patches along the hood. The left rear fender had a crack that had been welded and re-welded twice. The seat was a replacement, not original, a Tractor Supply cushion bolted over the original pan. The front tires were newer than the rest of the machine, which meant they were from the early 1970s. The rear tires were original and showed it. The auctioneer started the bidding at $200 and got no takers. He dropped to $150 and got one hand, a scrap dealer from Waterloo who was clearly thinking in terms of iron weight rather than operational value. Gus Henderman raised his hand at $50 as a counter, and the scrap dealer shrugged and let it go. $50. The crowd around the auction block had maybe 30 people in it, and a handful of them laughed. Not cruelly, but with the easy amusement of people watching a transaction that confirmed their sense of how the world worked. A 48-year-old Allis-Chalmers Model B with original rear tires and a cracked fender going to a man for $50 because even the scrap dealer had decided the iron wasn't worth the drive. The man standing closest to Gus when the hammer came down was named Phil Strasser. Phil was 45 years old, farmed 600 acres in the northeast corner of Bremer County, and had arrived at the auction that morning with a specific list of equipment he was considering and a checkbook that reflected an operation doing well in the late 1980s recovery from the farm crisis. He looked at the Model B on the auction block, and he looked at Gus loading it onto his flatbed trailer with the ramps he had brought specifically for this purpose, which suggested he had known what he was going to buy before he arrived, and Phil said something that he would remember for the rest of his life, not because it was particularly clever, but because of what it cost him later. "Gus," Phil said, "what on earth are you going to do with that?" Gus finished securing the front axle chain before he answered. "Work," he said. Phil looked at the Model B. At its 48-year-old frame and its original rear tires and its Persian orange paint peeling in the April sun. "That thing hasn't done real work since Eisenhower," he said, and 2 or 3 men nearby smiled at that. Gus climbed up into his truck cab without further comment and drove home on the county road with a 1939 Allis-Chalmers Model B on the trailer behind him and $50 less in his pocket than he had arrived with. Now let me tell you about Gus Henderman, because you need to understand the man before you can understand the machine, and you need to understand both before the rest of this story makes the sense it deserves to make. Gus was 58 years old in 1987 and had farmed 160 acres in Bremer County since 1962, when he bought his first ground at the age of 33, with savings accumulated from 15 years of hired farm work beginning at age 18. He had grown up in a farmhand household. His father had never owned land, had worked for wages his entire life on other men's farms, and the experience of watching his father work hard for someone else's equity had given Gus a specific and lasting attitude toward debt. He would not carry it. He had paid cash for every acre he owned and for every piece of equipment he ran, and the discipline this required had shaped everything about how he farmed. He was not a large operation. 160 acres in Bremer County in 1987 was a modest farm by the standards of neighbors who had expanded through the boom years, and Gus had no plans to expand. He had watched the expansion years with the careful attention of a man who had seen his father work hard without accumulating anything, and he had understood intuitively what the economists were still calculating, that borrowed money at high interest rates against inflating land values was a structure that depended on conditions staying favorable, and conditions did not stay favorable. His neighbors who had borrowed heavily to expand in the 1970s had spent the early 1980s in varying degrees of financial difficulty. Gus had spent the early 1980s farming his 160 acres with paid-off equipment and no particular anxiety. His equipment reflected his philosophy in the direct way that a man's tools always reflect what he actually believes rather than what he says he believes. He ran a 1961 John Deere 3010 as his primary field tractor, bought used in 1974 for $3,200 cash, and maintained since with the same methodical attention he gave everything he owned. He had a 1968 combine that he had rebuilt himself over 2 winters in the machine shed. He had a grain truck that was older than his combine and ran perfectly because he had never let it run any other way. And now he had a 1939 Allis-Chalmers Model B that he had bought for $50 at a dead man's auction, because he had a specific use in mind that he had not shared with Phil Strasser or anyone else at the auction that morning. Before we go further, if something in Gus Henderman's story has already spoken to you, if his patience and his quiet certainty remind you of someone you have known or something you have believed, take a moment right now and hit subscribe. May good things find you wherever you are. And may God walk beside you through every season, the easy ones and the hard ones both. Now let me tell you what Gus did with that tractor over the following 15 years and why it mattered more than anyone watching him drive it home that April morning could have imagined. The Model B went into Gus's machine shed on a Saturday afternoon and came out the following Monday morning running better than it had run in 20 years. Not because Gus had done anything dramatic to it over the weekend. He had done what he always did with equipment he brought home. Gone through it systematically, addressed what needed addressing, left alone what did not. He cleaned the carburetor, which was gummed from sitting. He set the valve clearances, which were loose. He replaced the points and condenser in the magneto, standard maintenance on a machine of that age and ignition system. He drained the old oil and put in fresh. He greased every fitting on the machine and found 3 that had been neglected long enough that the grease had dried completely and needed to be worked back to life with patient applications over 2 days. The engine, when it ran clean, produced its rated 16 horsepower without complaint. The transmission shifted through its 4 forward speeds without grinding. The hydraulic lift, a simple system by any standard, raised and lowered the attached implements with the reliable indifference of a mechanism that had been doing the same thing for 48 years and had no reason to stop. Gus used the Model B for exactly what he had bought it for, the light work on his operation that his 3010 was too large and too expensive to run efficiently. The garden ground behind the house, 2 acres of vegetables that Helen Henderman had been managing with a walk-behind tiller for the past 6 years, because running the 3010 on that ground was like using a sledgehammer to crack an egg. the fence line cultivation that required a narrow machine to get between the posts. The small field corners where the big tractor couldn't turn without compacting the headland. The orchard rows where the clearance under the branches required something low and narrow. For all of these tasks, the Model B was, in the plain mechanical sense of the word, the correct tool. It used perhaps a quart of diesel an hour on light work. It fit in spaces the 3010 could not enter. It was light enough that it did not compact the garden soil the way heavier equipment compacted it. And it cost essentially nothing to operate beyond the diesel and the 20 minutes of attention Gus gave it at the start of each working day. Phil Strasser drove past occasionally over the years and saw the Model B working in the Henderman garden or along the fence lines, and the sight of it confirmed whatever he had thought at the auction in 1987, that Gus Henderman was a capable farmer who had an inexplicable affection for old equipment that belonged in a museum. Phil's own operation had continued to grow through the late 1980s and the 1990s, reaching 1,200 acres by 2001, and his equipment line had grown with it. New tractors every 4 or 5 years, a new combine in 1995 that cost more than Gus's entire farm had been worth when he bought it, a grain handling system that had required a $200,000 investment in new bins and auger equipment. Phil was not reckless. He was a good farmer and a careful manager, and his operation was genuinely productive. But he was farming at a scale that required everything to work as planned, that left little margin for the unexpected, and that depended on equipment performing at its designed capacity in designed conditions. He was not thinking about what happened when the conditions changed. The conditions changed in October of 2002. Let me tell you about that October because it is where the $50 tractor earned its place in the story permanently. The harvest of 2002 in Bremer County had been complicated from the start by a wet September that had left the low ground soft and the creek bottoms nearly inaccessible. Most of the upland corn had been combined without serious difficulty, but Phil Strasser had 180 acres in a river-bottom field that sat below a natural terrace along the west branch of the Cedar River, accessible only through a field lane that crossed a low section of ground near the creek bank. The lane had always been soft in wet years. In October of 2002, after 6 inches of September rain and another 2 inches in the first week of October, it was something beyond soft. Phil's combine, a 2000 case IH2388, worth approximately $180,000, had gotten into the bottom field on the first dry day of October by moving carefully and staying on the crowned center of the lane. The corn in the bottom was good, better than the upland, in fact, because the wet year had suited the river bottom ground, and Phil had been combining for 3 days when the weather changed again. Another inch of rain overnight. By morning, the lane was impassable for a loaded combine, and Phil had a machine sitting in a bottom field that he needed on the other side of a section of ground that would not support its weight. He called his equipment dealer in Waverly. The dealer sent a recovery truck, a heavy-duty unit with a winch rated for 30 tons, that afternoon. The recovery truck got to the edge of the soft section, assessed the ground, and the operator told Phil that pulling the combine through that section with the winch would either bog the recovery truck itself or damage the combine's undercarriage on the uneven footing at the creek crossing. He recommended waiting for the ground to firm up. Phil looked at the sky. The forecast showed rain for the next 4 days, followed by a hard freeze. If the ground froze before the combine was out, the machine would be locked in the bottom field until spring. Phil called 2 other recovery services. Both came out, and both reached the same conclusion. The ground was too soft, and the lane too narrow for conventional recovery equipment to work without making the situation worse. On the second day of this impasse, Phil's hired man, a young man named Travis, who had grown up in the area and knew most of the farmers within 10 miles, suggested calling Gus Henderman. Phil looked at him. Gus Henderman has a 1961 John Deere and a $50 Allis-Chalmers from 1939, he said. What exactly do you think he's going to do? Travis said he didn't know exactly, but that Gus had pulled equipment out of soft ground before with that old Alice, and that maybe it was worth a phone call. Phil made the phone call at 4 in the afternoon. Gus listened to the description of the problem without interrupting. When Phil finished, Gus was quiet for a moment. "I'll come look at it," he said. He arrived 40 minutes later in his 1971 Ford pickup with the Model B on the flatbed trailer behind it, along with a coil of heavy logging chain that had been his father's, and a set of snatch blocks that he had bought at a different estate auction in 1991 for $11. Phil met him at the field entrance and walked him to the edge of the soft section. Gus stood there for a while looking at the ground, at the lane, at the creek crossing 30 yards beyond the soft section. He walked the perimeter of the soft area slowly, pressing his boot into the ground at various points, feeling where the softness was deepest and where there was still some structure beneath the surface. He looked at the combine sitting in the bottom field beyond the crossing, at the angle of approach, at the crown of the lane, and where it fell away to the soft edges. Then he walked back to his trailer and unloaded the Model B. Phil watched this with the expression of a man trying to be polite about something he found difficult to take seriously. The Model B weighed 2,100 pounds. His combine weighed 33,000 pounds empty and was carrying a partial load of corn. The arithmetic was not encouraging. "Gus," Phil said carefully, "that machine weighs 2,000 pounds. My combine weighs—" "I know what your combine weighs," Gus said. He was attaching the logging chain to the Model B's drawbar with the calm efficiency of a man who has thought through what he is doing before he started doing it. "I'm not going to pull your combine. I'm going to move it." Phil looked at him. "What's the difference?" Gus looked up from the chain. "Pulling means I apply force directly against the resistance. Moving means I change the geometry so the resistance works with me instead of against me." He stood up. "Your combine doesn't need to be dragged through that soft section. It needs to be guided across it on a line that keeps its weight on the crown of the lane, where there's still some support. Your recovery trucks were trying to drag it straight through. That's the wrong approach." He set up the snatch blocks the way Eugene Pratt had set up his snatch blocks on Miller's Creek in a different county 6 years earlier. Not because Gus knew that story, but because the physics were the same, and men who understood physics arrived at the same solutions independently. 2 direction changes in the chain line, each one managed through a snatch block, anchored to a fence post that Gus had checked and pronounced solid, creating a pulling geometry that angled the force along the crown of the lane rather than pulling the combine straight toward him across the softest ground. The Model B's 16 horsepower, multiplied through the block and tackle arrangement by a factor of 4, produced an effective pulling force of roughly 64 horsepower applied in a precise direction at a precisely calculated angle. It was not enormous force, but it was the right force in the right direction, and that distinction was everything. Gus climbed onto the Model B, engaged the PTO, and began taking up slack in the chain. The blocks creaked. The chain went taut. The combine, 33,000 pounds of it, shifted slightly in the soft ground as the load came on. Phil stood at the field edge and watched without speaking. The combine moved. Not dramatically, not quickly, but continuously, and in the right direction, guided by the chain geometry along the crown of the lane, keeping its weight where the ground could support it, crossing the soft section in the same way a careful man crosses ice, by distributing the problem rather than trying to overpower it. It took 40 minutes. The Model B moved at walking pace the entire time. The chain hummed with tension but held. The snatch blocks turned without complaint. The combine came across the soft section and up the slight rise to the firm ground on the other side and stopped there, intact, undamaged, ready to continue harvest. Phil Strasser stood looking at the combine on solid ground for a moment. Then he looked at the Model B, idling quietly beside the fence post where Gus was unhooking the chain from the snatch block anchor. The recovery trucks with their 30-ton winches were still parked at the field entrance. Phil walked over to where Gus was coiling the logging chain. He stood there for a moment without saying anything, the way men stand when they are deciding how to say something that does not come naturally. "Gus," he said finally, "that tractor is 53 years old." "53," Gus confirmed. "And it just moved my $180,000 combine when 3 professional recovery services couldn't." Gus laid the chain in its coil and looked up at Phil. "Your recovery services had more power than I do, a lot more. But they were trying to use that power in a direction the situation didn't allow." He looked at the lane, at the soft section with the combine's tire tracks running cleanly along the crown. The ground told you where the support was. The lane told you the angle. The chain and the blocks just let me use what the situation was giving me instead of fighting what it wasn't. He paused. "That's not about the tractor. That's about reading the problem before you try to solve it." Phil looked at the Model B for a long moment. At the machine he had watched Gus load onto a flatbed trailer for $50 at an auction in 1987 while the crowd laughed. At the 53-year-old engine and the original frame and the snatch blocks that had cost $11 at a different auction 6 years later. "What do I owe you?" Phil asked. Gus loaded the chain back onto the trailer. "Nothing," he said. "Your corn's going to get wet if you don't get back in that field." Phil looked at the sky, at the clouds building from the northwest, at the bottom field where 180 acres of good corn was waiting. He looked back at Gus. "Thank you," he said. It was a simple statement, and it contained more in it than those 2 words usually contain. Gus drove home on the county road with the Model B on the trailer behind him and the $11 snatch blocks in the truck bed and the logging chain coiled where it always rode, ready for the next time someone needed what it could do. Gus Henderman farmed his 160 acres until 2009, when he was 80 years old, and his doctor made the kind of argument that doctors make when they have been making it for 3 years and have finally run out of patience. He sold his land to his nephew Daniel, who had been helping on the farm since 2004 and who understood the operation and the equipment the way you understand things you have been taught carefully by someone who cared about the teaching. He kept the Model B. He kept the logging chain. He kept the $11 snatch blocks. Daniel still farms the 160 acres. The Model B is in the machine shed, started once a month, maintained the way Gus maintained it and Harold Pitts maintained it before him. The chain is on its hook. The snatch blocks are in the wooden box Gus built for them in 1992 from boards left over from a fence repair. Phil Strasser's operation grew to 1,800 acres by 2010, and he is still farming. He bought a new combine in 2008 and another in 2015. He has good equipment, and he manages it well. But he also, since October of 2002, carries a set of snatch blocks on every piece of heavy equipment he owns and has taught his hired men the basic principles of chain geometry and mechanical advantage that Gus Henderman demonstrated on that lane beside the Cedar River on an October afternoon. He learned it from a man with a $50 tractor and an $11 set of blocks. He has never forgotten where he learned it. The lesson this story leaves behind is this: the value of a tool is not what it cost. It is what it can do in the hands of someone who understands it completely. Phil Strasser's $180,000 combine was worth nothing to him sitting in a bottom field. Gus Henderman's $50 tractor and $11 snatch blocks were worth everything because Gus understood the problem, understood his equipment, and understood the geometry that connected the two. He did not have more power than the recovery trucks. He had better judgment about where to apply the power he had. The men who laughed at the auction in 1987 were looking at the price. Gus was looking at the potential. The men with the 30-ton winches in 2002 were looking at the weight of the combine. Gus was looking at the lane. The difference between those two ways of seeing is the difference between a man who is stopped by what a problem appears to be and a man who looks past the appearance to what the problem actually requires. Do not judge what you do not yet understand. Do not dismiss what has not yet had the chance to show you what it is. The most useful thing in any difficult situation is almost never the most expensive thing. It is the thing in the hands of the person who has taken the time to understand it thoroughly and completely and without shortcuts. That is the lesson. It cost $50 in 1987 and saved a harvest in 2002, and it is still sitting in a machine shed in Bremer County, Iowa, ready for the next time someone needs what it knows how to do. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you never to judge something by what it cost before you understand what it is worth, leave the word 50 in the comments. Just that one word. You will know why. And if you want more stories from the farms and the machine sheds and the people who understood that wisdom is not the same as wealth, subscribe. These stories are worth keeping, and there are more of them coming.